Section 12 of 3 Years in Europe, or Places I Have Seen and People I Have Met. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. 3 Years in Europe, or Places I Have Seen and People I Have Met, by William Wells Brown. Letter 12. Kirkstall Abbey, Mary the Maid of the Inn, Newstead Abbey, residence of Lord Byron, Parish Church of Hucknall, burial place of Lord Byron, Bristol, Cook's Folly, Chepstow Castle and Abbey, Tintern Abbey, Redcliffe Church. January 29. In passing through Yorkshire, we could not resist the temptation it offered to pay a visit to the extensive and interesting ruin of Kirkstall Abbey, which lies embosomed in a beautiful recess of Airedale, about 3 miles from Leeds. A pleasant drive over a smooth road brought us abruptly in sight of the Abbey. The tranquil and pensive beauty of the desolate monastery, as it reposes in the lap of pastoral luxuriance, and amidst the touching associations of 7 centuries, is almost beyond description when viewed from where we first beheld it. After arriving at its base, we stood for some moments under the mighty arches that lead into the great hall, gazing at its old grey walls frowning with age. At the distance of a small field, the air is seen gliding past the foot of the lawn on which the ruin stands, after it has left those precincts, sparkling over a weir with a pleasing murmur. We could fully enter into the feelings of the poet when he says, "Beautiful fabric, even in decay and desolation, beauty still is thine. As the rich sunset of an autumn day, when gorgeous clouds and glorious hues combine to render homage to its slow decline, is more majestic in its parting hour. Even so, thy mouldering, venerable shrine possesses now a more subduing power than in thine earlier sway, with pomp and pride thy dower." The tale of Mary, the Maid of the Inn, is supposed, and not without foundation, to be connected with this abbey. Hark to Rover, the name of the house where the key is kept, was, a century ago, a retired inn or pothouse, and the haunt of many a desperate highwayman and poacher. The anecdote is so well known that it is scarcely necessary to relate it. It, however, is briefly this. One stormy night, as 2 travellers sat at the inn, each having exhausted his news, the conversation was directed to the Abbey, the boisterous night, and Mary's heroism, when a bet was at last made by one of them, that she would not go and bring back from the nave a slip of the alder tree growing there. Mary, however, did go, but having nearly reached the tree, she heard a low, indistinct dialogue. At the same time, something black fell and rolled towards her, which afterwards proved to be a hat. Directing her attention to the place whence the conversation proceeded, she saw from behind a pillar 2 men carrying a murdered body. They passed near the place where she stood, a heavy cloud was swept from off the face of the moon, and Mary fell senseless. One of the murderers was her intended husband. She was awakened from her swoon, but her reason had fled forever. Mr. Southey wrote a beautiful poem founded on this story, which will be found in his published works. We spent nearly 3 hours in wandering through these splendid ruins. It is both curious and interesting to trace the early history of these old piles, which become the resort of thousands, 9/10 of whom are unaware either of the classic ground on which they tread, or of the peculiar interest thrown around the spot by the deeds of remote ages. During our stay in Leeds, we had the good fortune to become acquainted with Wilson Armistead, Esq. This gentleman is well known as an able writer against slavery. His most elaborate work is A Tribute for the Negro. This is a volume of 560 pages, and is replete with facts refuting the charges of inferiority brought against the Negro race. Few English gentlemen have done more to hasten the day of the American slave's liberation than Wilson Armistead. We have just paid a visit to Newstead Abbey, the far famed residence of Lord Byron. I posted from Hucknall over to Newstead one pleasant morning, and being provided with a letter of introduction to Colonel Wildman, I lost no time in presenting myself at the door of the Abbey. But, unfortunately for me, the Colonel was at Mansfield, in attendance at the assizes, he being one of the county magistrates. I did not, however, lose the object of my visit, as every attention was paid in showing me about the premises. I felt as everyone must, who gazes for the first time upon these walls, and remembers that it was here, even amid the comparative ruins of a building once dedicated to the sacred cause of religion and her twin sister Charity, that the genius of Byron was first developed. Here that he paced with youthful melancholy the halls of his illustrious ancestors, and trode the walks of the long-banished monks. The housekeeper, a remarkably good-looking and polite woman, showed us through the different apartments, and explained in the most minute manner every object of interest connected with the interior of the building. We first visited the monk's parlour, which seemed to contain nothing of note, except a very fine stained window, one of the figures representing St. Paul, surmounted by a cross. We passed through Lord Byron's bedroom, the haunted chamber, the library, and the eastern corridor, and halted in the tapestry bedroom, which is truly a magnificent apartment, formed by the Byrons for the use of King Charles II. The ceiling is richly decorated with the Byron arms. We next visited the grand drawing room, probably the finest in the building. This saloon contains a large number of splendid portraits, among which is the celebrated portrait of Lord Byron, by Phillips. In this room we took into our hand the Skull Cup, of which so much has been written, and that has on it a short inscription, commencing with "Start not, nor deem my spirit fled." Leaving this noble room, we descended by a few polished oak steps into the west corridor, from which we entered the grand dining hall, and through several other rooms, until we reached the chapel. Here we were shown a stone coffin which had been found near the high altar, when the workmen were excavating the vault, intended by Lord Byron for himself and his dog. The coffin contained the skeleton of an abbot, and also the identical skull from which the cup, of which I have made mention, was made. We then left the building, and took a stroll through the grounds. After passing a pond of cold crystal water, we came to a dark wood in which are two leaden statues of Pan and a female satyr, very fine specimens as works of art. We here inspected the tree whereon Byron carved his own name and that of his sister, with the date, all of which are still legible. However, the tree is now dead, and we were informed that Colonel Wildman intended to have it cut down so as to preserve the part containing the inscription. After crossing an interesting and picturesque part of the gardens, we arrived within the precincts of the ancient chapel, near which we observed a neat marble monument, and which we supposed to have been erected to the memory of some of the Byrons, but, on drawing near to it, we read the following inscription: "Near this spot are deposited the remains of one who possessed beauty without vanity, strength without insolence, courage without ferocity, and all the virtues of man without his vices. This praise, which would be unmeaning flattery, if inscribed over human ashes, is but a just tribute to the memory of Boatswain, a dog, who was born at Newfoundland, May 1803, and died at Newstead Abbey, November 18, 1808. By a will which his lordship executed in 1811, he directed that his own body should be buried in a vault in the garden, near his faithful dog. This feeling of affection to his dumb and faithful follower, commendable in itself, seems here to have been carried beyond the bounds of reason and propriety. In another part of the grounds we saw the oak tree planted by the poet himself. It has now attained a goodly size, considering the growth of the oak, and bids fair to become a lasting memento to the noble bard, and to be a shrine to which thousands of pilgrims will resort in future ages, to do homage to his mighty genius. This tree promises to share in after times the celebrity of Shakespeare's mulberry and Pope's willow. Near by, and in the tall trees, the rooks were keeping up a tremendous noise. After seeing everything of interest connected with the great poet, we entered our chaise and left the premises. As we were leaving, I turned to take a farewell look at the Abbey, standing in solemn grandeur, the long ivy clinging fondly to the rich tracery of a former age. Proceeding to the little town of Hucknall, we entered the old grey parish church, which has for ages been the last resting place of the Byrons, and where repose the ashes of the poet, marked only by a neat marble slab, bearing the date of the poet's birth, death, and the fact that the tablet was placed there by his sister. This closed my visit to the interesting scenes associated with Byron's strange eventful history, scenes that ever acquire a growing charm as the lapse of years softens the errors of the man and confirms the genius of the poet. May 10. It was on a lovely morning that I found myself on board the little steamer Y, passing out of Bristol Harbor. In going down the river we saw on our right the stupendous rocks of St. Vincent towering some 400 or 500 feet above our heads. By the swiftness of our ferry steamer we were soon abreast of Cook's Folly, a singular tower built by a man from whom it takes its name, and of which the following romantic story is told. Some years since, a gentleman of the name of Cook erected this tower, which has since gone by the name of Cook's Folly. A son having been born, he was desirous of ascertaining, by means of astrology, if he would live to enjoy his property. Being himself a firm believer, like the poet Dryden, that certain information might be obtained from the above science, he caused the child's horoscope to be drawn, and found, to his dismay, that in his 3rd, 16th, or 21st year he would be in danger of meeting with some fearful calamity or sudden death, to avert which he caused the turret to be constructed and the child placed therein. Secure as he vainly thought, there he lived, attended by a faithful servant, their food and fuel being conveyed to them by means of a pulley basket, until he was old enough to wait upon himself. On the eve of his 21st year his parents' hopes rose high, and great were the rejoicings prepared to welcome the young heir to his home. But, alas, no human skill could avert the dark fate which clung to him. The last night he had to pass alone in the turret, a bundle of faggots was conveyed to him as usual, in which lay concealed a viper which clung to his hand. The bite was fatal, and, instead of being borne in triumph, the dead body of his only son was the sad spectacle which met the sight of his father. We crossed the channel and soon entered the mouth of that most picturesque of rivers, the Wye. As we neared the town of Chepstow, the old castle made its appearance, and a fine old ruin it is. Being previously provided with a letter of introduction to a gentleman in Chepstow, I lost no time in finding him out. This gentleman gave me a cordial reception, and did what Englishmen seldom ever do, lent me his saddle horse to ride to the Abbey. While lunch was in preparation, I took a stroll through the castle, which stood near by. We entered the castle through the great doorway, and were soon treading the walls that had once sustained the cannon and the sentinel, but were now covered with weeds and wild flowers. The drum and fife had once been heard within these walls. The only music now is the cawing of the rook and daw. We paid a hasty visit to the various apartments, remaining longest in those of most interest. The room in which Martin the Regicide was imprisoned nearly 20 years was pointed out to us. The castle of Chepstow is still a magnificent pile, towering upon the brink of a stupendous cliff, on reaching the top of which we had a splendid view of the surrounding country. Time, however, compelled us to retrace our steps, and after partaking of a lunch, we mounted a horse for the first time in 10 years, and started for Tintern Abbey. The distance from Chepstow to the Abbey is about 5 miles, and the road lies along the banks of the river. The river is walled in on either side by hills of much beauty, clothed from base to summit with the richest verdure. I can conceive of nothing more striking than the first appearance of the Abbey. As we rounded a hill, all at once we saw the old ruin standing before us in all its splendor. This celebrated ecclesiastical relic of the olden time is doubtless the finest ruin of its kind in Europe. Embosomed amongst hills, and situated on the banks of the most fairy-like river in the world, its beauty can scarcely be surpassed. We halted at the Beaufort Arms, left our horse, and sallied forth to view the Abbey. The sun was pouring a flood of light upon the old grey walls, lighting up its dark recesses, as if to give us a better opportunity of viewing it. I gazed with astonishment and admiration at its many beauties, and especially at the superb Gothic windows over the entrance door. The beautiful Gothic pillars, with here and there a representation of a praying priest, and mailed knights with saints and Christian martyrs, and the hundreds of scriptural representations, all indicate that this was a place of considerable importance in its palmy days. The once stone floor had disappeared, and we found ourselves standing on a floor of unbroken green grass, swelling back to the old walls, and looking so verdant and silken that it seemed the very floor of fancy. There are more romantic and wilder places than this in the world, but none more beautiful. The preservation of these old abbeys should claim the attention of those under whose charge they are. And we felt like joining with the poet and saying, "O ye who dwell around yon ruins, guard the precious charge from hands profane. O save the sacred pile, o'er which the wing of centuries has flown darkly and silently, deep shadowing all its pristine honors, from the ruthless grasp of future violation." In contemplating these ruins more closely, the mind insensibly reverts to the period of feudal and regal oppression, when structures like that of Tintern Abbey necessarily became the scenes of stirring and highly important events. How altered is the scene! Where were formerly magnificence and splendor, the glittering array of priestly prowess, the crowded halls of haughty bigots, and the prison of religious offenders? There is now but a heap of mouldering ruins. The oppressed and the oppressor have long since lain down together in the peaceful grave. The ruin, generally speaking, is unusually perfect, and the sculpture still beautifully sharp. The outward walls are nearly entire, and are thickly clad with ivy. Many of the windows are also in a good state of preservation, but the roof has long since fallen in. The feathered songsters were fluttering about, and pouring forth their artless lays as a tribute of joy, while the lowing of the herds, the bleating of flocks, and the hum of bees upon the farm near by, all burst upon the ear, and gave the scene a picturesque sublimity that can be easier imagined than described. Most assuredly Shakespeare had such ruins in view when he exclaimed, "The cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and, like the baseless fabric of a vision, leave not a wreck behind." In the afternoon we returned to Bristol, and I spent the greater part of the next day in examining the interior of Redcliffe Church. Few places in the west of England have greater claims upon the topographer and historian than the Church of St. Mary's, Redcliffe. Its antiquity, the beauty of its architecture, and above all the interesting circumstances connected with its history, entitle it to peculiar notice. It is also associated with the enterprise of genius, for its name has been blended with the reputation of Rowley, of Canning, and of Chatterton, and no lover of poetry and admirer of art can visit it without a degree of enthusiasm. And when the old building shall have mouldered into ruins, even these will be trodden with veneration as sacred to the recollection of genius of the highest order. Ascending a winding stair, we were shown into the Treasury Room. The room forms an irregular octagon, admitting light through narrow unglazed apertures upon the broken and scattered fragments of the famous Rowleyan chests, that with the rubble and dust of centuries cover the floor. It is here creative fancy pictures forth the sad image of the spirit of the spot, the ardent boy, flushed and fed by hope, musing on the brilliant deception he had conceived, whose daring attempt has left his name unto the intellectual world as a marvel and a mystery. That a boy under 12 years of age should write a series of poems imitating the style of the 15th century, and palm these poems off upon the world as the work of a monk, is indeed strange, and that these should become the object of interesting contemplation to the literary world, and should awaken inquiries and exercise the talents of a Southey, a Bryant, a Miller, a Matthias, and others, savours more of romance than reality. I had visited the room in a garret in High Holborn, where this poor boy died. I had stood over a grave in the burial ground of the Lane workhouse, which was pointed out to me as the last resting place of Chatterton, and now I was in the room where it was alleged he obtained the manuscripts that gave him such notoriety. We descended and viewed other portions of the church. The effect of the chancel, as seen behind the pictures, is very singular and suggestive of many swelling thoughts. We look at the great east window. It is unadorned with its wonted painted glass. We look at the altar screen beneath, on which the light of day again falls, and behold the injuries it has received at the hands of time. There is a dreary mournfulness in the scene which fastens on the mind, and is in unison with the time-worn mouldering fragments that are seen all around us. And this dreariness is not removed by our tracing the destiny of man on the storied pavements, or on the graven brass that still bears upon its surface the names of those who obtained the world's regard years back. This old pile is not only an ornament to the city, but it stands a living monument to the genius of its founder. Bristol has long sustained a high position as a place from which the American abolitionists have received substantial encouragement in their arduous labors for the emancipation of the slaves of that land. and the writer of this received the best evidence that in this respect the character of the people had not been exaggerated, especially as regards the Clifton Ladies' Anti Slavery Society. End of Letter 12. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.